No.
I see you have B.F. Skinner there.
Yeah. Some of the
Yeah.
Skinner, yeah, Fitzgerald, some people, yeah.
Here, I'll show you mine.
Okay.
This is one of my prized possessions.
Okay.
It's a photograph of me with B.F. Skinner.
Oh, oh, that's wonderful.
And it was at the very last Association for Behavior Analysis meeting that he attended.
Oh, great.
In the spring of 1989.
That's when I was born. The year I was
really?
born. Yeah. So,
yeah, I was very nervous, and it was before iPhones and things like that. So I knew he was going to be in this room because there was a big event going on, and so I was kind of stalking him, outside, waiting with my camera and everything, and then he just walked up just all by himself, and usually he'd have a mob of people around him, but he was just by himself, and I got my courage up, and I went over and I said, "Dr. Skinner, could I get my picture taken with you?" And he was so sweet, and he just said, "Well, certainly, young man." And then he solicited someone to take the photograph and everything. And
I'm kind of in the same position right now. I'm very nervous. Let me start with this question. How can we make sense of addiction? What is addiction, and how can we make a sense of it?
Well, that was my first area of interest when I became interested in psychology. It's sometimes people make sort of a joke of it that people get interested in areas that are personally relevant to them. So, anxious people study anxiety, and depressed people study depression, and addicted people study addiction, or sometimes maybe they have someone in their life who has suffered in that way. I never quite understood why that would be the object of a joke. It seems to me quite sensible that people who have some experience with struggle in an area, either personally or with someone who's close to them, might have insights into the sort of phenomenology of it, and like that might lead them to ask useful questions about the nature of that illness. And so, of course, I've always been quite public about my personal history, and which involves extensive, psychiatric hospitalization and really terrible drug and alcohol addiction for many years. And initially, my understanding of it was a very similar understanding to the general public, I think, which is, that addiction was a disease, and that it had a relatively unitary course, that it might begin fairly slowly, but that it would inevitably lead people to a complete breakdown in their lives, and ultimately prison and death. And so, when you look at it from the outside, it it's quite mystifying, I think. You know, you see people engaging in behavior that just seems so obviously harmful. And if you catch them at particular moments, they recognize that themselves, you know, that
Yeah.
they're engaging in this behavior that is destroying them, maybe destroying the lives around them. Now, of course, people will convince themselves for periods of time that that's not true, but if you catch a person at the right moment, they'll very often admit how mystifying it is uh, 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 to even to themselves, and tragic. And that was certainly how I understood myself. You know, I when I looked at my own addiction, it raised just a terrible self-contempt, and you know, I couldn't possibly have thought less of myself, and it mystified me why I could not behave the way other people behaved. And I think that that general understanding of it is the understanding that people who are addicted have. And I think it's generally the understanding that, you know, the general public has. They sort of shake their heads and they just think, you know, that's terrible. And I don't think of it the same way, needless to say. So as a matter of fact, one of the very first things that I found out when I started to study addiction from a scientific perspective was that there wasn't anything particularly unique in human beings becoming addicted to substances. And you could look at the literature and you could find all kinds of examples of animal models of addiction where you could put animals in certain circumstances and supply them with drugs, and you know, pretty soon they're pressing the lever for drugs, and even to the point where you give them choices between the drugs and, you know, food or, you know, water, and you know, they choose the drugs. And so what became interesting to me was not that people did it because you could get animals to do the same thing, but that people actually stopped, you know, that they were in the presence of these incredibly powerfully reinforcing substances. I mean, great, big, huge, immediate reinforcers. And somehow it was also the case that people in the midst of that would stop, even when stopping produced extraordinary pain. Now, even later in my understanding of the scientific evidence, I found another example of animals, animal models of addiction that perhaps helped me to understand how it is that people come to stop. See, I used to joke that, you know, rats in the addiction experiment, you know, never kind of got together and said, you know, hey, let's form a fellowship and, you know, hi, my name is Ben, and, you know, I'm an addict. It all started off rather innocently, you know, smoking experiment, you know, but the next thing it was the cocaine experiment. You know, that I joked that that never happened, but in fact, there are parallels with human recovery in the animal literature. So if you don't mind my describing it, there was a scientist in Canada who looked at animal studies of opiate dependence in particular. And what he saw was that for the sake of experimental control, each one of these rats was housed in an individual compartment. And so the rats were in isolation from one another. And what this Canadian scientist understood was that a rat is a very social animal, and that a rat is most happy when it's, with other rats. And in fact, you can actually model depression in social mammals like rats by isolating them. And so what this scientist said was, they're not studying addiction in rats, they're studying addiction in depressed rats, in depressed and isolated rats. And so what he did is he built this thing that he called Rat Park. And so it was this kind of expanse where the animals were housed together in a colony, and they had places where they could kind of hide and climb and interact. And it turned out that it was pretty easy to get the rats in isolation to drink the water that was opiated. All you had to do is put a little sugar in it, because the opiates are bitter, and they very quickly begin to drink the opiated water and would become addicted.
Yeah.
But the rats in Rat Park, where they were in this kind of enriched social environment, wouldn't drink the opiated water. And so then they thought, well, maybe it's the case that you have to get an exposure to the opiates long enough to become addicted, and then they'll take hold of your life, and and the animal will be addicted. So what they did is they made it so the only water that was available to the animals in Rat Park was the water with the opiates in it. And of course, the animals are going to drink water. So what they did is eventually they started drinking the opiated water. They became dependent on the opiates, just like the rats that had been housed in isolation. But they then introduced what they called choice days. And so on the choice days, the animal could choose either the water, the sweetened water with the opiates in it, or they could choose a pure water that had no opiates in it. And if you look at the animals that were housed in isolation, they would drink as much of the opiated water on those choice days, maybe even more. But the animals that were housed in these enriched social environments drank little or none of the opiated water on those choice days. And they drank instead the pure water, even though they were detoxifying from the opiates. So you could see the physical signs in these animals that they were detoxing, and all they had to do is drink the opiated water, and they would have, stopped that detoxification process. But they didn't. Instead, they chose the
Pure water.
The pure water. Now, this is a very, very interesting and very, very important thing. And if you think about it, it makes sense. So if you're a social mammal and you have the opportunity to be engaged in this rich environment, why would you want to cut yourself off from that contact with these numbing substances? If you're one of the animals that's in isolation, why would you want to be in contact with, those terrible conditions? And it turns out that you can look in human populations, and sometimes you find higher levels of addiction that are associated with these kind of difficult social environments. Now, of course, humans, we can find ourselves in a difficult social environment, and we can find ourselves isolated even when there are other people all around us, which makes it a little harder to understand. Like, how is it that a human can be alone even in a crowd? As we begin to understand that and how to get people connected to their communities, I think we begin to understand the process of recovering from addiction.
Hmm. So do you think that, the methods like 12 steps and all those things which are working, maybe are they also, allowing this type of a reconnection? Is the reconnection that's working there more than the methods or methodologies or protocols or something of that sort?
Well, and of course, if you talk among behavioral psychologists, a lot of them are not very friendly to the ideas of 12-step organizations, which is a little mystifying, really, because, and I think, some behaviorists get hung up on, like, I mean, certainly there are lots of things about 12-step and AA that are really outdated.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if you read the original AA literature, it's very male, it's very white, it's very Christian, and it's very cisgender. It's, it is a product of its time. But if you read past that and think functionally, and I were to tell you, well, here's an organization where people will find community and acceptance, that will teach people acceptance of discomfort in the service of valued ends, that will not judge them no matter how far they've fallen. Well, that seems like a potentially quite healing environment. What the, and in fact, although there are people who have made a whole career trashing AA and 12-step programs, the actual controlled evidence on introducing people to 12-step programs, it fares as well as, a CBT for depression or motivational interviewing. If you look at things like the big project match that was done in the 1990s, the outcomes in the 12-step facilitation condition did as well. Some people just can't stand AA. And so I never press anyone to become associated with 12-step organizations. But if they can, I mean, the plain fact of it is that a lot of behaviorists don't like it because they talk about God. But I mean, the overwhelming majority of people in the world don't have any problem at all talking about God, or gods, or, that it's a minority view that God is like forbidden language, and spiritual practices are quite central to many people's lives. And to have,
it's also something in the upper crust, I guess. The intellectual upper crust is kind of more worried about it than the normal man, because God is also a consolation person can hook on to sometime, right?
Yes, I mean, I think it's a kind of a scientific view. I mean, in 12-step programs, they propose spiritual solutions, and I wouldn't weigh in on that as a scientist. I don't, but I would weigh in on the impact of spiritual practices as part of valued living. So for people for whom a spiritual practice is important, and for people who have fallen out of those spiritual practices in the midst of addiction, I would say that it makes, quite good sense for them to refine themselves in a spiritual practice, in the same sense that, having a family is also not a scientific treatment for addiction. But if you've fallen away from your family and you can begin to make your way back into the family, then
helps a lot. Yeah.
we know that social support is a good thing in recovery from addiction, a critical element in recovery from addiction.
So like if isolation is the biggest factor when it comes to, this sustaining of addiction and even beginning of addiction, how can a therapist or somebody who helps an addict help this person to reconnect? How is it possible in your view?
The question that you're asking is one that I think ought to be asked about all mental health conditions. In fact, I would say it's a question that ought to be asked about all health conditions, period, because social isolation and social disconnection are an enormous risk factor for every modern world illness that there is, from diabetes to cardiovascular disease to depression, anxiety, and certainly to addiction. And so I always think, the general understanding of addiction and mental health problems, I think, is that they are inside the person.
Mm-hmm.
That it's like a disease, and that the disease is in the person. And I do not find, I am not the least bit convinced by the evidence that there is a disease in the person. If I have cancer, then, there are tests you can run. You can show me the cancer cells. If I have a brain tumor, you can point to the brain tumor, but, where is the addiction? Where is the depression? Where is the anxiety? And I would say that it is not in here, it's in here. That it resides in very substantial ways in the relatedness of a person to the world around them. So for me, all manner of psychological difficulties, including addiction, mean that I'm going to begin to find small ways that a person can start to reconnect and to sort of remake themselves as part of their community. So, things like 12-step groups, if a person is open to those, I think can be a quite good and useful place to practice the kinds of skills that we teach in ACT. Openness to experience, being present, in those interactions.
Doing what matters.
Yes, exactly so. Saying out loud, what it is that you are devoting your life to, owning up to mistakes and correcting those. A lot of these things, I think, can have they're very consistent with ACT. And they're very consistent with a number of different recovery organizations. And I don't just mean 12-step. That's just the most broadly available one. But I would encourage people to go to any kind of recovery group that helps to get people reconnected. And then also, small ways that people can begin to reconnect with their community that are pro-social, where they can begin to feel that they are of use in their community, that they have a place in them, because addicts are so often marginalized by their communities and by themselves.
Yeah.
They view themselves as not suited to the world and a detriment to the world. And it doesn't have to be so.
Yes.
Recovery is a real thing.
Yeah. Here there is also another, some of the clients which I had a teenager who started peddling drugs because, he wanted to feed his family. And, that's one of the cases which we experience in this reality in India. Children start drug addiction as a part of peddling, but then they are seriously connected at the beginning of it, but then it affects them and their family and things of that sort. So kind of the social change is kind of inevitable, I guess. Or do you think that social change is something that's so much important than personal transformations when it comes to dealing with problems like addiction or something of that sort?
Let me make sure I'm understanding you. You're
Yeah.
saying that people become involved um, with drugs in selling them,
Yes.
a way to, I mean, and it's true in lots of places where, you know, trafficking in drugs, even in, very small
Yeah.
amount, is maybe the one of the only economic opportunities that people have.
Yeah.
Of course, one of the troubles with that is that as soon as you start trafficking in drugs, it means that more and more of the people you're interacting with are people who are using drugs. And because we're social mammals,
Mhm.
we tend to do things that are like, the people who we are associating with. And if you combine that kind of social environment where drug use is normalized with the very powerful um, uh, reinforcing effects of the drugs,
Mhm.
that is a tremendous combination that sets a person up for chronic patterns of use. And of course, the more they become connected with that, the less they become connected with the world that is kind of outside of that drug using world. So it starts to compound itself. Um, people go from having one or two friends who are involved to maybe a place where everyone they know is involved in that way. Um, and they're brought together both by the use of the substances and by their kind of shared mm, defensive posture against the policing of those substances, kind of partners in crime, if you will. And I don't mean that in a, like, nobody's like born and says, oh, I want to grow up to be a drug dealer.
Yeah.
uh, Nobody grows, says, I want to grow up to be a drug addict. um, it can be quite insidious, the conditions that
Mhm.
produce.
Mhm. After the recovery, how does that sustaining the recovery looks like? In your experience, doctor, what are the things that a person who has recovered from drugs for some time, but leaving that recovery should be careful about?
Mhm. Well, one thing that we know, and you can see this in the animal models also, is that um, relearning,
Hmm.
and this is not just true of drugs, but of
Any.
any behavior,
Yeah.
is that relearning is often quite a lot faster than learning. So, learning to swim can be challenging, but once you've learned, it doesn't take too long in the water to get swimming again. Lots of um, highly practiced behaviors are like that. Is that reacquisition can sometimes be quite rapid. I mean, another problem I would say is that um, I mean, I've always been a harm reduction guy. And I would actually even argue that 12-step programs are harm reduction programs. Even though their stated goal is abstinence, they don't kick people out for, getting high. It's not like you get drunk and they kick you out of AA or anything like that. If you get drunk, they say, keep coming back. you know. So their stated goal is abstinence, but they welcome people back forever,
Yeah.
even if they are chronically relapsing. Um, so I would argue in that regard that that AA is a harm reduction. It isn't their intent to be harm reduction, but they are in practice a harm reduction. And so I always take the view that you know any way that we can reduce harm is a benefit. And so when we talk about the things that put people at risk, um, I would say use of substances puts people at risk of problematic use of substances. Not as inevitably so as the 12-step programs. You know, they pretty much say, you know, once you cross that threshold, the threshold is crossed. And any use, no matter how moderate, will inevitably lead back to full relapse. That actually just doesn't seem to be true. Although it is true in some large data sets that people with really severe addiction problems um, only rarely, at least in the evidence that I'm aware of, only rarely have successful, stable, moderated outcomes. But there are a lot of different I mean, it is addiction is not a yes no thing. You know, drug dependence is not a yes no thing. So, you know, it's also true that there are people who probably meet the criteria for dependence, but um, um, are ultimately able to achieve moderated use outcomes. In a practical way, and even the programs that teach moderated alcohol use, for example, always advise people to take, I think, 30 or 60 days abstinence at the outset. As a practical matter, when I'm working with someone, you know, I'm pretty upfront with the risks that are involved with moderate use. So, you know, you take a drug like alcohol. Well, one of the very first effects of alcohol is that it is disinhibiting. That's why if you go to the dance club, you know, at the beginning of the evening, nobody's on the dance floor, but, you know, then, but they want to be on the dance floor, but they're a little nervous, you know, and they have a little drink. And then, you know, all of a sudden it becomes okay, you know, they can go talk to someone and they can go out on the dance floors. So that disinhibition, you know, sort of says if there's something that you really want to do and you just add a little bit of alcohol, it's a little easier to do that. Well, if the thing that you really want to do, but you're inhibited from doing, is drink really a lot, and drinking a little, you know, is risky. You know, it's risky. Whether any individual can moderate or not, I'm very upfront about the evidence for that. And I actually, in my book, The Wisdom to Know the Difference, I talk a little bit about, you know, long-term outcomes for people with, you know, pretty severe alcohol problems, you know, of how often people are able, you know, able to successfully moderate. And I'm pretty forthright with people, you know, if they started early, if they don't have a terribly stable social environment, if the addiction was pretty severe and of pretty long duration. I don't pull any punches. I tell people it's risky. It's risky. And I ask them questions like, what would have to happen? What would you have to lose before you became convinced that while some people may be able to moderate, I don't seem to be one of them.
Yeah.
That was certainly a choice that I had
Yeah.
to make, was that, I just became convinced that
moderation is not your.
it just never worked. I mean, I really wanted it to work. I really, really wanted it to work. Maybe just this drug or just this mode of administration or, just this combination or, just this amount. But I just never was able to make it work, and the last time I personally drank any alcohol was in 1985, and I had this revelation, that I could buy just a pint of vodka, and that if I only drank, just like 4 ounces, that it would be quite inexpensive and that I couldn't possibly get into any serious trouble drinking only 4 ounces. And it seemed like such a stroke of genius to me, but let's just say that when I drank that first 4 ounces, drinking the rest, it seemed like such a great idea. And, now, I mean, I'm quite, and, I've been around long enough and I'm familiar with the kind of long sort of data sets on people and alcohol use. And, the fact of the matter is the overwhelming majority of people do not become, addicted to drugs and alcohol. I mean, just the vast majority of people don't, even the ones who drink or use drugs problematically, the most common outcome is that they do that a little bit and then it just doesn't fit in their life. And, like it wrecks a relationship or it causes them to lose a job or maybe 2 jobs. And then they just,
done.
You see people experiment a lot, when they're, in their late teens or early 20s. But the most common outcome is that they moderate, but not everyone, And so, if I see people in that younger age group, I talk to them about, their risks downstream. If I see people, who have been in for a while, I'm pretty straightforward about, like I'll work with people, like, okay, do you want to see if you can have a moderated outcome? All right, let's see how that goes. What would need to happen? What's your plan? And, let's monitor and let's see how that works and what would have to happen before you would decide, that would cause you to decide this just, I can't do.
Doctor, when you're from your work all these years, what are the few, in your opinion, what are the few points which therapists should keep in mind when the person is working with the person who's suffering from addiction or something of that sort? What are your insights?
Well, because addiction is so frustrating and let me just say that that's both from within. So if you're working with someone and, they're relapsing, and they're maybe making improvements, and then they just crash the whole thing.
Yeah.
It's so frustrating. And everything in you, you just want to shake people, like, can't you see?
Yeah.
But I know of no evidence that confrontation um, is helpful uh,
Mm,
to anyone for just about anything.
mm, mm.
And in fact, if if confrontation and condemnation were a cure for addiction, people would already be cured.
Yeah.
They've already had that,
Lot of
including themselves.
yeah.
And so I would say, and if you think about it, we wouldn't do that to a person who was depressed. We wouldn't, like, what's the matter with you? Stop being, I can't believe you're depressed again. You know,
Yeah.
we worked so hard, but somehow with drugs and alcohol, um, people very often will take this kind of more punitive or confronting, this kind of tough approach.
Mm.
And it's a little mystifying, and I suppose it comes out of a history of understanding addiction as a moral failing,
Yeah. Mm, mm.
rather than as an illness. Because we don't ever think about confronting people or punishing them for diabetes or
Yeah.
depression or anxiety, but somehow it seems like the right thing to do with addiction. And so I would say it's important for clinicians to have heart for the suffering of the individuals in front of them,
Mm.
including when it is so frustrating. Now, you can't not feel frustrated. I don't know how to do that.
Yeah.
You can do a little perspective taking yourself as a clinician, and you can wonder, um, it must be so hard to find yourself doing better in the midst of addiction,
Mm.
and then to have things fall apart. You must feel so frustrated with yourself sometimes. And to approach a person like that,
Mm.
it's more welcoming, less condemning.
Yeah.
And I think that I have never seen anyone who is very successful working with addiction who could not adopt, a compassionate perspective um, with somebody in the midst of addiction. So I think, to give yourself pause and to do a little bit of perspective taking and to remember why it is that you're doing that work um, is a critical thing for anybody working in addictions. Um, we wouldn't treat a sick person that way,
Yeah. Yeah.
and to remember that. Um, Not to condemn ourselves with our frustration. I mean, the client almost certainly feels it themselves. In fact, if you confront, very often what you'll get is high levels of defensiveness
Yeah.
and denial. I mean, denial, a lot of times people say denial is part of addiction, but I would say denial is part of addiction situated in a social context
Mm, mm, mm.
where addiction is condemned.
Most of the
You know,
people are not getting help also, I think, fearing the condemnation and all those things that are going.
that's
Really,
absolutely,
we live
absolutely.
in a society, our place is a place where if you drink a little bit of alcohol, it's considered to be a sin, and it's viciously attacked on all fronts. So people are just so scared, I guess, to take help. Is that a problem that, when you're seeing it in the social context, when a person is guaranteed to be condemned, it makes
Yeah.
perfect sense not to seek help, right?
And when I train clinicians, I ask them to think about, like, have you ever been a problem for the people in your social world? Like think back into your childhood, maybe, were you ever any teacher's problem? Or
Mm,
were you ever your parents' problem? Or were you, your school's problem? Or some place in your life, or maybe you were your partner's, your wife's problem, or something like that. And what is it like every time you walk into a room where they're just waiting for you to do the next wrong thing?
mm, mm,
And just how hard it is to
yeah.
um, live in the midst of that kind of criticism, and how hard people will try to escape it. If people can find that in their own experience, then I think that can soften them in their interactions with people with addiction. Now, I mean, it doesn't mean that I'm going to give somebody who's a drug addict free access to my medicine cabinet.
No.
Uh, you know, um, I'm not going to put them in that position, or myself in that position. So, you know, you don't have to be foolish or weak to be compassionate.
Yeah.
Um, I think that's important. I think also a lot of people in addictions treatment have this idea of this kind of unitary disease model,
Mm,
that addiction always goes the same route every time. And I think that is an unsustainable, just empirically, it is unsustainable.
mm, mm,
Um, the paths into addiction are incredibly varied.
yeah.
For one person, it might be trying to make a living hustling a few drugs and then finding yourself using them increasingly. It might be a person in what appears to be a quite good family and social environment, but who feel for whatever reason
Mm,
um, uh, that they don't fit in the world that they are living in, that they feel a sense of isolation. And sometimes drugs can provide some solace,
mm, mm,
some peace in that. So I think people need to understand that there are many routes in,
yeah. Mm,
and that recovery may look very different for different people. So,
mm,
for
mm,
example, people going to AA, sometimes people will, what recovery looks like is continuous abstinence for a long period of time, where a person has a persistent connection to a recovery community for their entire lives.
mm,
But, I've known many, many people who, joined recovery communities, were active in those communities for a period of time, and then over time became sort of knitted into uh, lives and jobs and
mm,
families and marriages, who their connection with the recovery community just dropped away, and they do fine.
mm, mm,
um, in 12-step programs, a lot of people really have this idea that you walk out the door and you're going to go down, and that's just not sustainable. It's
mm,
just factually wrong.
mm,
If you look at natural histories of recovery, uh, working with people,
mm,
I think that we need to keep this in mind so that we can be sort of co-authors with the people we're working with of what will the shape of your recovery be,
mm, mm.
and to be open to um, a lot of different sorts of developmental trajectories.
Doctor, the
Mine
time,
was not the way that I thought it would.
the time you have given me has finished. Can I ask you one more question? Just one more. So that is it okay?
Yes, no problem at all.
Yeah. Is there any prevention? How can a community or a society or something of that, or an organization who's working with teenagers or young adults, what should they do? Can we do something for prevention? Is it possible? And then when it comes to recovery or helping the addicts, what can societies or communities do?
Well, I mean, I always think harm reduction. And when I say harm reduction, I mean that for people who are already addicted,
Yeah.
but I also mean that for people who are at risk for addiction.
Mm-hmm.
And so, for people who are at risk, for example, uh, teenagers who are going to get some exposure, that's going to be part of their environment. I think that as communities, we need to think about, what are the alternative ways that that person can connect with the social community, connect with a social community with a sense of purpose, where they're connected with others and share some common purpose and common goals that they work towards. I think that those kinds of things make it less likely that people it will reduce the level of risk. I think education about drugs and alcohol that is not, black and white, that is not, I mean, I remember when I'm almost 66 years old. And so the drug education I got was ridiculous. It was like the guy smokes marijuana one day and then the next day he's, shooting heroin, I mean, it was um, this absurd sort of all or nothing kind of version. And of course, kids can see through that.
Yeah.
They look around and they know that that is not true.
Mm.
And I knew when I was a kid and they were telling me this, that, wait a minute, there were people whose parents I knew who drank alcohol and who took prescription medications that were not different in kind from the recreational drugs that people were using. And I'm like, this doesn't quite add up to me, and I knew that when I was, 15 years old. And so kids know that. And so to give them a kind of a more realistic view of the potential risks, um, I think is worthwhile. But I think the emphasis is really on community connection and pro-social, kinds of things that people can be engaged in. Um, and then for people who are further in, who are currently using, then I think everything that we can do that makes the likeliness of their harm go down, I'm an advocate for that. So, like I grew up in Washington State, and myself, I was an IV drug user, opiates and amphetamines and all kinds of things. And when I was growing up, you could not get syringes legally in the state that I lived in. And so people shared injection equipment. I mean, everybody who injected drugs shared injection equipment. And, what it resulted in was rampant hepatitis C. I mean, everybody who I knew back in those days, it didn't even have that name. They called back then, they hadn't identified it. They called it non-A, non-B. So it looked like you had hepatitis, but you tested negative for B and negative for A. And I mean, everybody had it, There was a guy in a town near where I grew up who started this needle exchange. And so he was in a city nearby, and he took a van down where a lot of the drug addicts were, and he would exchange a brand new syringe for a used syringe. And it was actually against the law when he did it, although the police sort of left him alone.
Mm-hmm.
But, and people said, well, it's going to encourage the use of drugs. But nobody has a used syringe that, they've used multiple times, is trading it in on a new syringe. He's new to this. And every time you have that contact with that person, you have a chance to say, hey, dude, I might be able to get you a bed in this rehab, and maybe the guy says, nah, not for me, but but one day he comes and, to trade, and he says, you know, maybe I'll give it a try. And so every bit of our ability to preserve contact and connection with people who are in the midst of these addictive processes, I think that we should have, that we should foster community resources that maintain that connection, even if people are actively using and not planning on stopping. I think that to the extent that we can have contact with them, we keep having these opportunities where we can invite them sort of, back into the community. The day we shut the door on them, completely,
Helpless.
yeah, it so that sort of anything we can do to foster ongoing connection, to let people know that there is someone who cares, and to make whatever resources available that we can, I think is critical.
Thank you, Doctor. This was a very illuminating conversation. I'm sure that this will help us and the people who are watching this. And we're so grateful for you giving your time, and thank you so much for that.
Well, I began my recovery a little over 35 years ago, June the 1st, 1985. And, I'd been a daily drug user for 15 years. And I had wrecked everything in my life that was important to me. And I couldn't have imagined a world where I could, inch my way out of that life, day by day, just doing the next right thing and the next right thing and the next right thing to find myself in a world where I could be useful to people halfway around the world. I could never have imagined it. And so I'm grateful for the opportunity, and I thank you for it.